Environmental Ecology Modeling Working Group from the MMI seminar, from the MMI Institute. So it's our pleasure to have Dan hosted here at University of Manitoba today. Me and Dan kind of go way back now at Teams. We met a long time ago at a Society of Math Biology meeting in Montreal, and then I don't know, we've been in touch since, and it's been a lot of fun having Dan around in my network, and I hope he feels the same. For context, Dan did his PhD with Simon Levin at Princeton University, and then went on to do a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania with, can I remember the first name? Miro?
Yuichiro Mori.
Yuichiro Mori, and Jonathan Falkin. Dan's also been very influential in the field, publishing in many high-level journals, doing a lot of really interesting research. But one thing that I think is underrated, at least in Dan's career so far, is like the number of conferences and organization that he does. And I think it's really kind of indicative of like the network that he brings, bringing people together. And I think there's a running joke kind of going on in the math ecology world, at least, how we have like our equivalent of an Erdos number, but for like a Dan Cooney number of how many conferences you've been invited to by Dan, or how many sessions that Dan organized has been a part of. So I think that's a pretty special honor, at least from my point of view. So without any more me talking, you don't want to hear me. So I'll turn over to Dan, who's going to talk on some spatial pattern formation and cooperative behavior.
Oh, thanks so much, Chris, for the invitation and for the introduction. Thank you all for joining. And I wanted to mention, in terms of these conferences and traveling, that this is now my trip to my 5th Canadian province, and Chris is the only person I've seen in all 5 of those. So Chris has also been very involved in theoretical ecology and math bio. And yeah, I'm really happy to present on this today because a lot of these topics that I've learned about, particularly with spatial pattern formation, are things that I've learned from reading lots of papers from people in the PIMS community. And I also hope there are some nice connections with other spatial and metapopulation models we can think about in this context. And so I wanted to highlight the research team that I've been working with. And so this came about through a couple of different projects. One working with Tianyong Yao, who is an undergraduate student supported by the Illinois Undergraduate Office Research, and he's now at Michigan. We were working on spatial patterns in environmental or ecoevolutionary games. And a fun project I worked on with both Tianyong and Chening Xu through the Illinois Mathematics Lab, which is our undergrad RU, although Chening's now at Caltech. And a fun project that I like to call Our Patterns Good that I've been working on with Dennis Patterson, as well as Olivia Clifton and Stephanie Dodson. And an underlying sort of question that got me interested in some of this area was this idea about thinking about the shared governance of natural resources and sort of social dilemmas that arise when there's an individual incentive to extract as many resources as possible, but collectively would be better if we had sustainable extraction. And so the UN Food and Agriculture Organization often presents statistics on how many of the world's fisheries are currently overfished or maybe or at full capacity for harvesting. And so it's important to think about how we can maintain sustainable management of our resources. And so this is often described in terms of something called the tragedy of the commons, where individual incentives are misaligned with the collective incentive for sustainability. So I found out that Tufts University in Massachusetts, in the US, they have a dining hall that's called the Commons. And so they have their tragedy of the commons was everybody ate the French fries, and if you showed up late, you were left eating chicken fingers. But this is really the management of resources is one way to think about this sort of social dilemma between individual and collective incentives. And game theoretic models have often been used as a nice way to present these social dilemmas. And recent researchers like Joshua Weitz and collaborators, and Andrew Tillman, Errol Akshay, Josh Plotkin have been thinking a lot about evolutionary game dynamics, studying strategic behavior in response to environmental dynamics. These models are often studied, particularly in ODE frameworks, thinking about a single well-mixed resource. But we could also think about what happens in a spatial scenario. Does the diffusion of a shared resource sort of decrease the chance that you're able to maintain sustainable extraction? And can individuals performing directed motion, like trying to find better resources, can this create spatial patterns where there are clusters of sustainable extraction, other places where things are overexploited? And so basically, do spatial dynamics help or hurt overall sustainability as well as the heterogeneity in space in this regard? And so as a baseline model of strategic interactions, I would like to draw on two-player, two-strategy games, which I typically like to think of the two actions you can take as you can either be a cooperator or a cheater. But unfortunately, cheater and cooperator start with the same letter. So if we want to do subscripts and things like this, we call our cheaters defectors. So we use a different letter for the two strategies. But in this context of harvesting resources, it's often the cooperator or nice individual is often someone who has a low impact on the environment. So we'll call them low impact harvesters, and someone who is extracting resources more aggressively might be called a high impact harvester. And so following the approaches that Whites and Tillman, co-authors, think about, they think about these two-player games with basically interactions between the two types of extractors, which the individual game theoretic interaction may be a little bit abstracted from the actual act of extracting resources, but some authors have suggested that this is maybe how they compete over shared resources once they're extracted. And I think that was sort of an approach actually taken by some researchers at PIMS, including Hao Wang and collaborators have some work on these sorts of models. But generally speaking, two low impact harvesters, they're cooperators, they interact, they get a reward for their mutual cooperative behavior. Two high impact harvesters get punished for their mutual cheating behavior. And when a high impact and a low impact harvester interact, the high impact harvester gets a temptation to be a high impact harvester, and the low impact harvester gets a sucker pay for interacting with somebody who's more or less extracting resources. And there are different rankings you can put on these payoffs, and those will determine the incentives individuals have to take their different behaviors. So if it has the first ranking, the high impact harvesters dominate because the temptation exceeds the reward and the punishment level exceeds the sucker payoff. So no matter who your opponent is, you do better by following the high impact strategy. And there are other games, one called the Hawk Dove or Snowdrift game, where it actually makes sense to follow some cooperative behavior if your opponent's not so cooperative. And so in this case, basically, if you're facing a high impact harvester, you'd rather be a low impact harvester. So you have an incentive to do the more sustainable thing when you're interacting with a bunch of individuals who don't. Whereas in the other case, that stricter social dilemma, you always want to be a high impact harvester no matter what. And so this is sort of game theoretic models for interactions between individuals, but then we can think about what happens when a population of individuals interacts according to these games, and that this affects sort of the payoffs individuals have and their decisions to continue following those strategies. And so if we consider a population that has a fraction P of low impact harvesters and the remaining 1 minus P are high impact harvesters, if you play the game against all the members of your group, then the low impact harvesters fraction P of the time face other low impact harvesters and get a reward. The remaining 1 minus P fraction of the time, they face a high impact harvester and get the sucker payoff. You can do similar calculations for how the high impact harvesters do. And a famous model for describing the change in strategies over time is known as the replicator equation. Basically says that the change in the fraction of low impact harvesters is governed by whether the low impact harvesters or high impact harvesters have better payoffs. So when the low impact harvesters are doing better, they increase in frequency, otherwise they decrease. And there are equilibria at all low impact, all high impact, and maybe interior points where the payoff are the same. And so for that strict social dilemma, the high impact harvesters win out and P goes to 0. But for that Snowdrift or Hawk Dove game, you increase, or like you basically go to a stable intermediate point featuring a mix of the low impact and high impact strategies. And so this is sort of the classical description of evolutionary games, interactions where individuals either give birth or imitate each other based on the payoff received in the game. But we can also think about payoffs that arise that do have some impact, or somehow arise through a dependence on some level of environmental quality. You could think of this as sort of a number of fish if you're doing fishing, or some other measurement of environmental quality or resource level. that typically authors like to normalize it so that maybe they take a level of resource and they non-dimensionalize it so that you go between n equals 0 is a totally bad environment and n equals 1 is a totally good environment. And we can think of this, we basically construct payoff matrices that come from basically what would the payoffs be in a totally bad environment and what would they be in a totally good environment. And so prior authors have called these linear eco-evolutionary games, where basically you have higher payoffs when n is close to 1 and the environment is good, and you have lower payoffs when the environment is worse. And we can calculate the average payoffs based on the environmental quality through this and see how environmental quality can impact payoffs. But going the other way, we can ask, how does the strategic behavior of individuals impact the level of resources in the environment? And so this was the model that Weitz and co-authors and Tillman and co-authors were thinking about. They couple dynamics of strategic behavior and their consequences on the environment. So we have a replicator equation still based on these now environmentally determined payoffs. And also the environmental quality responds in such a way that basically when the environmental quality is poor and there are lots of low impact harvesters, that heals the environment. Whereas when the environment is good and there's a lot of high impact harvesters, that causes the environmental quality to go down. And so basically the low impact players help the environment and the high impact harvesters hurt the environment. And there's a nice possibility of an equilibrium when there's equal payoff conferred by both strategies and when the normalized measure of environmental quality is equal to the fraction of cooperators. And you could also have equilibrium where everybody's a low impact harvester or a high impact harvester. And so a lot of prior work by Weitz and co-authors, Tillman and co-authors explored all the dynamical behaviors you can have when game theoretic dynamics also have environmental feedback. And they're able to find that there are really nice cycling behaviors where I guess they use these terms following the gold rush or leading the gold rush and then leading the environmental movement and following the environmental movement. But basically in situations where in a good environment, you have an incentive to over-extract, or in a bad environment, you have an incentive to help heal the environment, you can get interesting dynamical behaviors like cycles between good environmental quality and good payoff, and then cases of low environmental quality. Bad payoff, we're not as interested in the non-spatial dynamics in as interesting dynamical behavior. We actually are curious about the case of when there's equilibrium. So an intermediate level of low impact harvesting and an intermediate environmental quality that's an equilibrium under that coupled system. And we'll eventually be at, sorry, I should probably move this. Yeah, so for our purposes, we'll eventually be interested in doing a spatial model. And so if we have a hub where lots of low impact and high impact harvesters are, we can't really have reaction dynamics where we're just studying the fraction of low or high impact harvesters, because we could have like places that are like hotspots and float spots have different population size. And so to think about spatial patterns, we want to think about more density dependent descriptions of the population, or at least varying density in the model a little bit. Instead of talking just about the fraction of low impact harvesters, we now introduce a number of low impact harvesters and a number of high impact harvesters, U and V respectively, and we keep the environmental quality, and we have to rederive some new ODE models for the strategic dynamics and how that interacts with and so I went to basically one of my favorite papers of all time, The Importance of Being Discrete and Spatial by Rick Durrett and Simon Levin, and where they formulate spatial models of evolutionary game dynamics where individuals either give birth or die based on their payoff, with the birth or death rate depending on whether their payoff is positive or negative, plus an additional density dependent manipulation, making sure the population size doesn't get too big at any location. The density dependent regulation might not be essential for our purposes, but it's just a nice model that I enjoyed building off of from Durrett and Levin. And so we basically formulate the low impact harvesters, their per capita birth rate is based on their payoff. And we assume that the interactions are still based on the fraction of low impact harvesters they interact with. So it's basically you have a fixed number of interactions and we care about the fraction you have with each type. You could also consider things that depend on the number because you could have more interactions with a bigger population. And I feel a little bit sad that this is the Maud Menton Institute seminar and I don't have any nice fancy functional responses. But I think in evolutionary game theory, there's a lot of room for saturating functional response in the idea that you have few interactions when the population is small, but you have a fixed number of interactions when the population size is really big. So if anyone wants to chat about fun functional responses in evolutionary game theory, I'd be happy to talk after the seminar or by Zoom, depending on where you are. And we employ a really nice method of cheating to talk about the environmental dynamics. And the reason I say it's cheating is we still have the environmental quality based on the fraction of low impact harvesters, although you could think that if there's more harvesters, that means more extraction of the environment. So the cheating here is we think that, well, it's nice to have it just be dependent on the fraction, but maybe we can think that there's still a finite access to, there's a fixed access at each location. So even if there are more of one strategy, it really only affects the actions taken sort of proportional, but it's mostly a simplifying assumption that we can relax a little bit if needed. And so this is a pretty nice model, but one sort of interesting thing we can do with it following Durrett and Levin is instead of, we can think, how can we reduce this to our previous model or see what of all that great dynamical behavior that's seen in the Tillman and White's papers can be recovered in this model that takes into account changing population size. And so we introduce some new variables, the fraction of low impact harvesters, P, which is, I guess, what we were already doing, but we're now stating it in terms of those numbers we defined, and Q, the total population size. Under this change of variables, we get something really nice where we actually recover exactly in our equations for P and N, the frequency dependent dynamics that we did, that White's and Tillman had thought about. And we get a third equation that's decoupled from, or the other two are decoupled from the total population size, which becomes its own equation that, so that first two terms in square brackets together make the average payoff of the population, because it's P times the fraction of cooperators times their payoff, plus the fraction of defectors times the payoff they get, and then minus kappa times total population size. So the non-zero population size equilibrium will be basically the average payoff over kappa will be the population size. And then the dynamics of P and N are independent of this. And so we can expect the same dynamical behavior of these models and then keep sort of population size as an auxiliary variable. So this adding and changing population size doesn't have to change our reaction dynamics that much, as long as we did our cheating technique from the previous slide. If we included density dependence in the end, we wouldn't get a decoupling, and we'd have to do things that are a little bit messier. And so now, I've been talking for a while already, and now I actually want to show the model from that we're really going to talk about for the rest, or most of the rest of the talk. We've set up what reaction dynamics we want, and now let's put in the spatial dynamics that we're really motivated by. So we consider now spatial profiles. We're going to do one dimension of the number or the density of cooperators, the density of defectors or low impact, high impact harvesters, and the density of the environmental quality. You could think of this as a spatial density of the fish or whatever resource you're harvesting. And we put in the same reaction dynamics as before, but we assume that harvesters can both have random motion. So they diffuse at some diffusivity depending on their strategy, or that depends on their strategy, but they also can perform directed motion where they try to climb towards increasing levels of environmental quality. So they're trying to find places with better environmental quality, which doesn't explicitly mean they're trying to get better payoff, but we know that better environmental quality means we're moving up to the better payoff matrix. The individuals, maybe this is something that they can see. They can see that there are more fish. They go that way. They don't know what their profit will be or something like this. Or we could think of this as if this is like microbial public goods or environmental resources, maybe they're just able to see something that is a signal of what's good. And then we assume the resources diffuse, but the resources aren't making any intentional decisions. They're just doing regular random walks. And we'll solve this just to fix the topic. We'll solve it on some interval with zero flux boundary conditions. And so studying the spatial patterns in this model will be kind of the main goal of at least what we're talking about for this class of models. And okay, so I made that nice change of variable before that decoupled things. And so I should have mentioned this slide as a joke. If you're taking notes, don't take notes. If you use the same change of variables, it looks like a horrible mess, but it's really not. And the reason is, for spatial pattern formation, we're eventually going to use linear stability analysis. So we're only going to see what the linear effects are in the model. And so with our variables Q, P, and N, there are lots of nonlinear terms here, like QX, PX, multiplied by a lot of things. So those partial derivatives all go to 0. And so we should only be looking at the linear terms here. And so this actually won't be so terrible, especially when we can also make some assumptions like what happens when du is equal to dv. So the overall movement rates of low impact and high impact harvesters are the same. Lots of these terms will go to 0. And the way that we did this change of variables will help a lot in us understanding the emergence of patterns. And so our approach for studying, so we have those equilibrium states that were sort of derived by Tillman and Weitz about the coexistence of low and high impact harvesters and an intermediate quality environment. And so we ask, in our spatial model, if we start really close to a uniform state where everywhere we're at equilibrium, if we make a small perturbation from those equilibrium states, will the perturbation tend to grow? And so by using the approach of linear stability analysis, we can perform an expansion and see what do we expect to be the growth or decline in the patterns. And should mention, I really enjoyed learning lots of these techniques about spatial pattern formation from folks all over the prairies and Western Canada, the PIMS Institution. So I really enjoyed, learned a lot from these papers. And so in the linearist case, so we get rid of all the nonlinear terms with those perturbations. And it turns out that the perturbation in the total population size, the fraction of low impact harvesters, and the number of individuals, actually, it's not that bad of an equation. There are these terms like C11Q, C12P. Those are the elements of the Jacobian matrix for the ODE dynamics. And so we really have to look at how do things differ now that we have spatial terms and we have basically cross-diffusive effects. So like the change in the population size depends on something proportional to a diffusion term in Q, a diffusion term in P, and a diffusion term in N. And so we basically get a matrix of diffusive-like terms and reaction terms. And we want to see when can the effects of these terms lead to positive eigenvalues of our linearization once we sort of plug in a guess of a sinusoidal perturbation, like when we solve linear PDEs, like the heat equation, we plug in this perturbation, and it turns out that if we let the low impact and high impact harvesters diffuse at about the same rate, we can get a really nice threshold for how much directed motion, this chi-u, which says how sensitive are the low impact harvesters to differences in environmental quality, we're able to get a threshold on how much of that directed motion do we need in order to get the growth of these perturbations and basically have spatial clustering of low impact and high impact harvesters. And there's a lot to interpret in some of these thresholds. The chi-v is on this side means the more that the high impact harvesters are good up and down the environment, moving up environmental gradients, the harder it is to form clusters, because when high impact harvesters are moved to good environments, they make those environments worse. And so they decrease these sort of hubs of good environments. And there are other things we can interpret. It turns out, so it's also increasing typically in the diffusion of the resource. So if the resources diffuse, that flattens out the places where there's lots of good environment. And so you can see how the diffusion of resources of the resource and the directed motion of the high impact harvesters hurt the formation of these clusters, but we're able to form clusters with high environmental quality and high payoff if low impact harvesters are good enough at moving towards better environments. There's a feedback where they make the environment better and then draw more low impact harvesters who further make feedback better, et cetera, et cetera. And you can actually plot using some numerical simulations starting near that uniform state. So when chi-u is close to that threshold we calculated, we get sinusoidal patterns of, if we plot basically in this case, we're plotting the payoff of low and high impact harvesters. The dashed line is what would the payoff everyone would get in that coexistence equilibrium. And we see that there are about 3.5 hubs where both the low impact and high impact harvesters have better payoff than they'd have in the absence of spatial motion. And we see that these are correlated to the peaks of the environmental quality. So we have some places that are like refuges or like high quality environments featuring high payoff for the harvesters. And in fact, the high impact harvesters do really well when they can get into a place with good environment. But then there's also these troughs where the environment is worse and the payoffs are worse for each type. And in fact, the low impact harvesters are the ones doing better in that case. And so we see these different spatial profiles. So in some places, the outcome is good. But we actually, if we have even stronger directed motion, we continue getting spatial patterns. But we end up seeing something interesting where even the peaks, even the places with really good environment and really good payoff are worse than the uniform state when we have really strong directed motion of low impact harvesters to bad environments. And I should mention, if anyone from, for example, UBC happens to be on the call, I've talked to Daniel Gomez about this, and he sees spikes in these models. So people who like the spike patterns, this might be an interesting model to look for spikes. But in any event, these we see that we're like everything's getting worse everywhere. And so to quantify this, we can also look at overall, was there any time that the patterns were good in the sense of improving payoffs? And we see that as we increase the sensitivity of the environmental motion, so the amount that we care about low impact, the amount that low impact harvesters care about moving towards better environments, we see that below the threshold, we basically get the payoff of the uniform state. And then the payoffs end up getting worse for both strategies, although the low impact harvesters get the better of the two. So their directed motion does give them a relatively a better payoff than the high impact harvesters. But the environment is overall degraded, and so are the payoffs relative to motion. And so the spatial motion is actually bad, moving towards better environments by sustainable individuals, like the low impact harvesters who are the sustainable extractors. Them moving towards higher quality environments decreases the overall environmental quality. So somehow it's not a very good mechanism for making more sustainable extraction. And I know among the audience, at least Chris, but maybe others will be also interested in sort of like transient dynamics of this. So what happens I was showing mostly steady state kind of outcomes, but it isn't actually the case that things are always getting worse. So if we plot the position against time, I think this is a plot of payoff, but it would be similar if we plotted the environment. We have initially kind of a blob close to the uniform state, but over time aggregates form in space for payoff, and we get, I don't know, 8 or so peaks. And then over time they coarsen, but they actually get really concentrated when 2 peaks merge. So that basically when there's 2 places with good environment, the individuals who are nearby from one hub and the other are drawn to each other's environment, making a really good environment and really good payoff. But over time, my guess is competition degrades the environment. So there are times, if you look at where there are these jumps in the average payoff of the population, where the peaks merge, we see these little upticks in overall payoff. So quickly things get better, and then they drop off and get way worse. And so you can sort of see this kind of social dilemma of spatial movement arising through sort of the short-term kind of potentially more like transient scale dynamics. So I thought might be interesting to folks interested in transient dynamics. And so overall for this project, there's some nice takeaways where directed motion by these sustainable harvesters can make things worse, even though you'd expect them to create some hubs with really good payoff, which they do, but the emergent patterns end up decreasing average payoff and average environmental quality. And there are a lot of really fun extensions we can think about. So this was the kind of the more boring case of the uniform stable equilibrium being destabilized by space, but one might be interested in studying more complex spatial patterns that arise when we also have cycling kind of behavior predicted by the reaction dynamics. So things kind of like the directed motion equivalent of like a Turing-Hopf stability or something like this. And I've neglected to mention this model also would can display a Turing instability when the cheaters diffuse much more than the cooperators, and we have no directed motion at all. So these kinds of, there's lots of really interesting feedbacks of these models that might be interesting to explore. And so in this sort of spatial games direction, I wanted to mention another project that I was doing just kind of quickly, where we don't think as much about environmental quality. We just have individuals playing games, and the individuals try to move based to improve their payoff. So we have cooperators and defectors here, or I guess they're hawks and doves was the names following Tourette and Levin. But here we have the individuals trying to climb towards better payoff, which ends up looking up at like a like a higher order, or like sort of a directed motion term depending on payoff. And they also have the same sort of, they give birth based on payoff, and they have logistic regulation. And the F and G were from a prior version of the model where it's a more complicated version where there are functions determining how payoff. But this is a similar model, but there's only cooperators, defectors, no environment. And this model is in some cases easier because we can study, if we set WU/WV equal to 0, we actually can study Turing patterns in this model. And we do have diffusive driven instabilities when cheaters diffuse much faster than cooperators. And it turns out that unlike the directed motion patterns, in this case, Turing patterns actually increase the overall payoff. So when it's just fast random motion by cheaters, it actually can produce some better environments that way. And for anyone interested in these sorts of, particularly in like sort of the things like well-posedness or sort of reasonable behavior of these PDE models, when we include directed motion, but we have diffusion, the mobility of each type equal, we actually get like infinitely many unstable wave numbers when we do the linear stability analysis. So maybe there could be some blowups or questions related to well-posedness. And so I had one sort of, I had a friend when I was a postdoc who went viral, had a meme about dense walkable urbanism and sort of how to build cities. And so this raised an interesting question about these density dependent effects about moving to better environments. Could this apply to things like gentrification or properties of cities, how sort of the like urban landscapes arise, or even like the formation of metropolitan areas? And so I think there's some fun papers by Nancy Rodriguez and Juan Restrepo that go in that direction. So I just wanted to shout out my friend's funny meme. But overall, I was kind of a little, I don't know, I was upset, but this question of when you study spatial patterns, typically this is considered a thing that you like finding pattern formation mechanisms. And part of this is because they're fun and there's cool math. And also, like, if you make a model and you can't find patterns, that's boring, and then you don't have like a thing to do at that point. Like, you just say, okay, we didn't find a pattern formation mechanism. So one thing that I wanted to think a little bit more is, why is it that this directed motion end up making the environment worse? And so do the individuals in a population, or even the undirected motion makes things better? There's this question of, why do certain mobility mechanisms end up making the payoff better and some making it worse? And so there are lots of these chemotaxis models and different generalizations and applications that let you explore a lot of interesting spatial behaviors. And in particular, what I liked about that game theoretic model we were using, the spatial version of the Whites or Tillman models, is that we can keep score of whether the pattern was good, in the sense of, was the payoff high? In an ecological model, you could also think of fitness, like just calculating how many individuals or the size of the population. But in game theory, we can tell these fun stories about cheaters and cooperators and who gets the better of the outcomes, whether the cooperators or the cheaters win. And one thing that I really appreciated, particularly from, this is maybe the place where I really learned from the papers from members of this group and from across PIMS, was weakly nonlinear analysis. It's a really cool window for understanding these sorts of analytical approximations. And I thought this might be a fun thing to explore in these questions. And so as kind of a toy model, before, like, our model is kind of complicated with 3 PDEs and all the payoffs and things like that, the nonlinearities are kind of annoying, and particularly the ones where we have a denominator, we're talking about fractions, because then nobody wants to do expansions like with binomial series. This kind of get messy. So we'll start with something that's just kind of a slight generalization of the Keller-Siegel model. So we have a population whose density is n, and they have a chemical signal that they're following, C. And so the population itself, they diffuse, they perform directed motion, trying to move towards higher levels of the chemical. And they have population dynamics that could depend just on their own population size. So it's common to just put logistic growth as one. This is, I guess, people call this the logistic growth model, or sorry, the Keller-Siegel model with logistic growth. And then we put like a pretty simple feedback on the chemical. So the individuals in the population deposit the chemical, and the chemical also decays on its own. You could do more complicated interactions where that C depends on things. If we were thinking about, there's some people who applied these models to studying like economic pattern formation and the emergence of cities and things like this. But this is kind of like the small, like a pretty small model where we can figure this out. And so beyond the linear stability that we had talked about, if we're doing these weakly nonlinear approaches, we consider finding asymptotic expansions of both the population and the chemical. And so we start with those equilibrium levels, N0, C0. So N0, C0 is some stable equilibrium of the reaction dynamics. And we consider a small perturbation of order epsilon. That's basically what we got from the linearization. And we also have some higher order corrections to that that occur with really small parameter in front of them. And we assume if we're close to the threshold for pattern formation, so that the chi is close to that threshold chi you need to get patterns in the chemotaxis model, that that we're within epsilon squared above or below that point. And so we consider a small time scale for growth of the patterns because we're really close to the threshold where patterns won't grow at all. And so we have this spatial, so if we have an equilibrium to the reaction dynamic, so N naught is such that we have F of NC is equal to 0. And then from the deposition and decay, that gives alpha over beta N naught as the equilibrium value of the chemical. Then if we perform a linearization of our model as we've done before, we get something that looks like this, where we have the effects of diffusion on the main diagonal. And then there's, sorry, this should be partial sub XX in the top right, describes the effect of chemotaxis. We can describe this in terms of the partial derivatives of the reaction terms, the effects of basically how reactions will come to things. And for chi big enough, we'll see that we can get instability of our uniform state. And when you do this expansion, you basically are doing the method of, or it's a matched asymptotics approach where you basically find an equation at each order of epsilon. So the order 1 effect basically is just capturing that the reaction terms are at equilibrium. The order epsilon effect is what we saw with the linear stability analysis before. And we start getting maybe more interesting things at order epsilon squared. We basically have the reason that, I guess, one reason this is like such a useful method is if we're trying to solve for N2 and C2, they're having the same linear operator act on them. And then all the other terms in this equation were solved for either from setting the linearization equal to 0. So basically that we're at the critical threshold, or that we're at equilibrium. And so we can solve basically an equation for N2C2 depending on things we've already solved for. And it becomes kind of like a forced linear equation. And so with the kind of the guess of a sinusoidal perturbation and saying that there's some slow amplitude varying how patterned our population is, how big is our oscillation from the uniform state, we can find that something like this will be our solution. And this constant M says basically, will our patterns be correlated or not? Will, where the population is high, correspond to high chemical? And the answer for the Keller-Siegel type models where individuals are moving towards a higher chemical and they're producing the chemical, leading to more individuals wanting to go there, it turns out to have a positive correlation. So we have lots of individuals, we also have lots of chemical. So we can solve that equation up to this order. And when we look to solve for the second equation, this is kind of what I had mentioned before. We get a system of equations where the linearization matrix operating on our order epsilon squared solution, the N2C2, is given by these two terms, which are basically from plugging in all the forms we'd seen before, some stuff that's constant in space, and some stuff that is proportional to cosine 2 times the wave number of what N1 and N2 were. And the key point is with sort of the method of undetermined coefficients, we can get a solution for the second order, the epsilon squared behavior. And what's really nice about this is there's a constant term, which because N1 and C1 was a cosine, if we were to integrate our total population size, we get the uniform state times the length of our domain, then a cosine that integrates out. And if we integrate this term, which will have an epsilon squared in front in our expansion, this cosine also integrates out, but the constant term, the U20 and V20 numbers, will tell us, did our pattern grow or decline relative to the uniform state? So did our population go up because they followed the spatial patterning process? And what's really nice about that is you can calculate these terms and how they depend on the higher order derivatives of the reaction kinetics at the equilibrium point. So I guess we are back into a little bit of Newton territory, thinking about what functional forms that we'd like. And what we end is, for the case of logistic growth, at least, the size of the population always goes down in this case. And so a logistic growth is often assumed in a lot of these spatial pattern models, but it carries with it this assumption that, at least for the reaction dynamics we're thinking about and the spatial motion that we're thinking about, that we're thinking of a population size that's always going to go down. And so maybe we need to think about other functional forms, maybe of how n depends on itself or how n depends on c, in which population size can go up in the pattern state, where the fitness of the population can go up due to these spatial mechanisms. Otherwise, we're sort of doomed to have kind of a worse interaction. So this isn't always the case, like in the undirected motion model, the Turing patterns in the games, we did have that the payoff went up. So there are times patterns can be good. And another example where patterns are good, another nice, another kind of model that's been very popular out here is the non-local KPP model and other sorts of non-local reaction diffusion models. And so here we have a population in a spatial domain, but we have an integral, which means we have to have periodic boundary conditions to do all the same mathematical tricks. But basically a population is diffusing in space, also having basically logistic growth, except that the competition with others is based on some integral of a kernel of how much you weigh your competitors away from you in space. And so it models this joint effect of spatial diffusion and spatial competition. And it turns out that if everyone's at the carrying capacity, the right-hand side of this equation is 0, or both sides of this equation are 0. So that's a stable equilibrium in the non-spatial dynamics for the reaction terms. And one can show that patterns can occur in the case of negative Fourier transform for some wave number, which this happens, for example, for hat kernels. So you have equal competition with everyone within a certain distance and then no competition outside it. But it's not possible if we have like a Gaussian kind of kernel for competition. So there's a lot of argument about whether this is maybe a super realistic mechanism, potentially. But even in these hat kernel cases, if these patterns can form, it turns out that one can show with a similar analysis of going up to the second order that the population size in the pattern state always goes up. And this kind of makes sense because the spatial clustering means that maybe there are individuals who are not going to be near you anymore because they moved elsewhere. And so you have less competition now for your reproduction, and so your population goes up as well. And so decreasing competition seems to increase population size, where I think directed motion creates these clusters, which then suffer from logistic regulation with no really strong maybe allele effects or positive effects pushing you back towards the uniform state, even though logistic regulation pulls you down. And so I just wanted to highlight there's a lot of these really fun different models, and I'd be happy to chat them, and also really happy to have learned so much of this stuff. Members of my group. And yeah, I guess I didn't have any slides on this, but everything I did was in just continuous space and with sort of PDE type models, but I've really been interested in sort of network versions of these models. And so we have some ongoing work where the directed motion takes place on nodes of a network. And there are at least certain cases where the linear stability and some of the subsequent analysis suggests some similar behaviors about population size going down. And so I hope to be able to share some of that soon. And in addition, just would like to, interact with anyone who has any interest in these models, because I think there's a lot of excitement. Both, the game theory models are always fun with cheaters and cooperators, but I think there are some ecological settings where people study networks as sort of network habitat kind of situations. And then I think the social dynamics of thinking about networks within and between cities may also be an interesting setting. And so just wanted to share some papers. So the paper by Whites and Tillman were sort of, or Whites and co-authors and Tillman and co-authors were particularly of interest in how sort of it was fun to think about these. This is just one of my favorite papers of all time by Victor and my advisor, Simon. And I just really like the way that they described going between sort of discrete stochastic models and continuous PDE models as sort of a framework of how we write down models and analyze them, but also the fact that they did it with game theory was, I really liked evolutionary game theory, so that was fun. And so we have two preprints. So this is the one I mostly talked about, the one with Tianyong, and just maybe a week ago or so, Tianyong and Chenning and I put out a preprint on these the evolutionary games without environmental driven motion, which has the Turing pattern stuff and the infinite wave number instabilities, as well as we compared a lot of individual based stochastic models and the behavior PDE models in that paper. And Chenning actually produced a Python package called PyEgy, so it's pi for payoff, and then EGY for evolutionary game theory, using the Y, I guess, as part of the acronym. And I think if you want to do these simulations yourself, we encourage you to download the PyEgy package as well. And so in any event, lots of fun stuff in this direction, and I'm happy to talk about this current stuff for ongoing work as well. So thanks so much.
All right, any questions here? And if you have questions on Zoom, you can raise your hand or probably just unmute and start speaking, either or, but I'll look at the chat as well. So any questions here?
So thanks for the talk. I was wondering, this is like an earlier point where you were talking about like the diffusion of U and V. So like there was a point where if we assume du equals dv, then we were able to do some nice parts. But then you also looked at the case, okay, what's if one is less or one is greater? But I'm wondering, like in the situation of these sort of like high impact versus low impact, are all these cases actually realistic, or like in terms of like this diffusion, or like is there actually an example that have similar like where the du and the dv would actually be equal to each other?
Yeah, so I guess there's the question of maybe how much you can move. I guess we were taking the du and dv as an effect of the movement rates, and then the chi-u and chi-v is more the like how much you care about moving. And so we had some derivations from biased random walks of that. But I guess I was thinking of individuals that are equally capable of moving, like maybe from the same species, but that the ones that are extracting are spending their time doing that, whereas the individuals who are more sustainable have more time to like think about where they're going to move. But it could also be that the same energy could be put into moving more or this thing. So I think maybe it's not a model that thinks about different trade-offs of how you actually make these choices to move or extract that have more of a